Hello everyone. In this video, we will talk a little about the history of slavery in the United States, the mistreatment of Black women by slave owners and famous African American slave owners. Slavery in the United States refers to the legal institution that existed in the United States of America during the 18th and 19th centuries. Slavery was practiced in British America from the beginning of the colonial era and was firmly established when the United States Declaration of Independence was signed. 12 million Americans were sent to America between the 16th and 19th centuries. Of these, an estimated 645,000 were sent to what is now known as the United States. The largest number was transported to the Caribbean and Brazil, where life expectancy was short and slaves had to be constantly replaced. Life expectancy was much higher in the United States, generally because of better food, less illness, less work, and better healthcare. So the numbers grew rapidly, with births exceeding deaths. The slaves were chained and packed into a space so small they could not move. Like many, a third of this group died on each trip that lasted 8 weeks. Those who survived were often separated from their families and sold to different slave owners. The first African slaves in North America arrived in Virginia to work on tobacco plantations in 1619. The slavers carried out the so-called triangular trade. They loaded rum, tobacco, and weapons to Europe, exchanged it for slaves in Ivory Africa, and sold the slaves for profit in America. From there, they returned with raw materials and minerals to Europe. During transit, approximately 50% of the slaves died. The slave ships were designed to carry more than 400 people, packed as close together as possible. On the 2-month voyage from West Africa to the Americas, the hardships suffered on those long voyages across the Atlantic produced such terror among the poor individuals that they came to wish they were dead rather than continue living in those conditions. The first 20 Blacks arrived near Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, brought by Dutch traders who had commandeered a Spanish slave ship. The Spanish normally baptized slaves in Africa before shipping them, and English law considered them baptized Christians, exempt from slavery. So these Blacks joined 1,000 indentured officials already situated in the colony. Slavery in the United States existed in the 18th and 19th centuries, and previously among Indians, who commonly enslaved east of the Mississippi and many west of it as well. Slavery had already been practiced in British North America since early colonial times and was recognized by the 13 colonies at the time of the Declaration of Independence of 1776. After the Revolutionary War, abolished laws proliferated in the northern states, although the rapid expansion of the cotton industry from the 1800s left the southern states strongly identified with slavery and attempted to extend it to the new western territories. Through the 17th century, European settlers in North America turned to enslaved Africans as a cheaper, more plentiful labor source than the indentured servants, who were mostly poor Europeans. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, people were kidnapped from the continent of Africa, forced into slavery in the American colonies, and exploited to work in the production of crops such as tobacco and cotton. The slave population in the United States had grown to 4 million according to the 1860 census. It must be taken into account that within the aberrations produced by the slave owners, there was also the obligation of procreation among slaves by their owners. This rose from the idea that a strong woman with a strong man gave birth to a strong Black child, a new slave. Most of the slaves were owned by plantation owners, who are defined by historians as having 20 or more slaves. 95% of Black people lived in the South, representing a third of the population of that region. By comparison, in the North, Black people only represented 2% of its population. Slave labor was a major factor in the accumulation of wealth in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. Slavery itself was never widespread in the North, though many of the region's businessmen grew rich on the slave trade and investments in southern plantations between 1774 and 1804. Most of the northern states abolished slavery or started the process to abolish slavery. but the institution of slavery remained vital to the South. Though the U.S. Congress outlawed the American slave trade in 1808, the domestic trade flourished, and the enslaved population in the United States nearly tripled over the next 50 years. How were black slaves treated in the United States? Both were forced to perform exhausting work, subjected to physical and mental degradation, and deprived of their most basic rights. Enslaved men and women were beaten mercilessly, separated from their loved ones arbitrarily, and, regardless of their sex, treated as property in the eyes of the law. Slavery generally included abuse and cruelty by masters toward slaves, although slaves could often be treated more humanely if they were considered valuable property. The slave faced a hard life on the plantations, where the work was hard and the hours were long. On a sugar plantation, some slaves worked in the fields and others worked in the processing factories, and they were often poorly fed. Many of them were also whipped or beat for the smallest mistake, and many died shortly after arriving on the plantations. Even the strongest rarely survived more than 10 years, and very few saw their homeland again. Black people in the colonies, enslaved or indentured servants, was made clear with the passage of the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705, a series of laws that stripped away legal rights and legalized the barbaric and dehumanizing nature of slavery. Slavery would remain rampant in the United States of America as an independent country. In the U.S. Census, the number of enslaved people in 1790, at the time of its independence, increased from almost 700,000 people to 4 million of people in 1860. Shortly before its abolition, an event that also generated strong political tension that led to the American Civil War. From the 1830s to the 1860s, the movement to abolish slavery in America gained strength, led by free black people such as Frederick Douglass and white supporters such as William Lloyd Garrison, founder of the radical newspaper The Liberator, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who published the best-selling anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. By the end of the Civil War, roughly 179,000 black men, 10% of the Union Army, served as soldiers in the U.S. Army, and another 19,000 served in the Navy. Nearly 40,000 black soldiers died over the course of the war, 30,000 of infection or disease. Black soldiers served in artillery and infantry and performed all non-combat support functions that sustain an army as well. There were nearly 80 black commissioned officers. Because of prejudice against them, black units were not used in combat as extensively as they might have been. Nevertheless, the soldiers served with distinction in a number of battles. In addition to the perils of war faced by all Civil War soldiers, black soldiers faced additional problems stemming from racial prejudice. Racial discrimination was prevalent even in the North, and discriminatory practices permeated the U.S. military. Segregated units were formed with black enlisted men and typically commanded by white officers and black non-commissioned officers. While many abolitionists based their activism on the belief that slaveholding was a sin, others were more inclined to the non-religious free labor argument, which held that slaveholding was regressive, inefficient, and made little economic sense. On September 22, 1869, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and on January 1, 1863, he made it official that slaves within any state or a designated part of a state in rebellion shall be thenceforward and forever free. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States, was passed on December 6, 1865. With the ratification of the 13th Amendment, 4 million African Americans, nearly a third of the population of the South, were permanently freed and slavery was abolished in the United States. Some historians consider the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution intended to abolish slavery, but in reality, the amendment allowed slavery to remain legal to favor the Southern slave states. Due to the disagreements over the Emancipation Proclamation of black slaves, in many slave states, decades later, racial segregation was established. Jim Crow laws and implementation of the Black Code. We have to talk about the lynchings of blacks and incarceration of blacks for minor crimes to make them do forced labor. By the mid-19th century, America's westward expansion and the abolition movement provoked a great debate over slavery that would tear the nation apart in the bloody Civil War. Though the Union victory freed the nation's 4 million enslaved people, the legacy of slavery continued to influence American history from the Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement that emerged a century after emancipation. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like this topic about the history of slavery in the United States, please leave your comments as a way to help the growth of this channel.